She crossed an entire country for a man who was about to shatter her world in less than 60 seconds. He thought he was sending her away broken. He had no idea he was unleashing the one person who could burn his entire life to the ground. The train's whistle screamed as it pulled into Timber Falls, a tiny logging town carved out of the vast Oregon mountains. The sound was like a blade, sharp and cold. Steam billowed across the platform, tasting of iron and endings. Lennon Monroe stepped out of the passenger car, and the world seemed to shrink around her. She was tall, not just a little tall. At 6'2", she was a giant in a world built for smaller people. The handful of rough-looking loggers scattered on the platform stopped talking. Their eyes crawled over her, from the worn toes of her boots to the determined set of her jaw. She was a spectacle, an oddity, and she knew it. In her hand, she clutched a leather satchel holding everything she owned. Tucked inside was a stack of letters that had promised her a new life. 8 months of correspondence with a man named Rhett Lawson, the owner of the town's main sawmill. His words had been a lifeline. He wrote of partnership, of building something real. He wrote of wanting a strong woman to stand beside him. He'd painted a picture of a life she'd only dared to dream about. But in all those letters, full of talk about timber shipments and Sunday dinners, there was one thing neither of them had ever mentioned: her height. Lennon had prayed it wouldn't matter. She convinced herself that a man who wrote with such kindness wouldn't care about something so trivial. She was wrong. A man was walking toward her from the direction of the sawmill. He was average in every way. Average height, sandy hair, a face that was neither handsome nor plain. He matched the small photograph he'd sent, but the kind eyes she'd imagined reading her letters by candlelight were now filled with something cold, something that looked a lot like horror. His steps slowed as he got closer, his gaze traveling up and up and up. "Miss Monroe?" he asked, and his voice was thin, uncertain. "Mr. Lawson," she said, forcing a smile. She extended a gloved hand, trying to project a confidence she absolutely did not feel. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you." He barely touched her fingers before letting go, as if her hand were hot to the touch. The silence between them stretched, thick and suffocating. The loggers by the saloon were watching, and she could feel their smirks from across the platform. Then he said the words she'd been dreading her whole life. "You're quite tall." "Yes," she said, her chin held high. She'd learned a long, long time ago never to apologize for the space she occupied in the world. He winced, his face tightening. "I need a wife, Miss Monroe, a wife who fits the role." He couldn't even look at her now. His eyes were fixed on the mountain peak behind her head. A woman should look up to her husband, not down at him. From near the saloon, a rough voice shouted, "Looks like you ordered a redwood instead of a rosebush, Lawson." Rhett's face went crimson. The humiliation was a poison, and it was spreading fast. "I'll arrange your return passage," he said, his voice clipped and distant. "The eastbound train comes through on Tuesday." Every word was a hammer blow against her heart. "I spent everything I had to get here," she said, her voice quiet but steady. The crack in her chest was widening into a chasm. "I'm sorry," he muttered, but he didn't sound sorry at all. He sounded annoyed. He was already backing away, turning his back on her, on the promises he'd made. Truly sorry. And then he was gone. He left her standing there, alone on a splintered platform in a town she didn't know, with a worn-out satchel and dreams that had just been ground into dust under his heel. The cold mountain air bit at her cheeks, a cruel welcome to Timber Falls. She was stranded. She was penniless. She was the town's new joke. But as she stood there, feeling the weight of a dozen pairs of eyes on her, she didn't cry. She didn't crumble. Instead, a cold, hard resolve began to form in the pit of her stomach. Rhett Lawson thought he could just throw her away like trash. He had no idea who he was dealing with. She turned her back on the station and the whispers and started walking toward the edge of town, her long strides eating up the dusty ground. She walked past the general store, past the church with its lonely, weathered cross, heading for the tree line where the giant pines stood like ancient, silent judges. She needed to think. She needed a plan. She found a fallen log and sat, the silence of the forest a welcome relief. She let the sheer scale of the trees wash over her. Here among these giants, she didn't feel out of place. She felt home. Beautiful view from up here. The voice came from behind her, low and rumbling like distant thunder. She spun around to see a man leaning against a massive pine, his arms crossed over his chest. He was tall, taller than her by a good few inches, with dark hair that fell over his forehead and eyes the color of a gathering storm. He was built like he'd been carved from the mountain itself, solid and unmoving. "Name's Creed Maddox," he said, his voice direct, without a trace of the judgment she'd seen in every other man's eyes. "I run crews for the Northern Logging Operation." "Lennon Monroe," she replied, her guard immediately up. What did he want? Was he here to mock her, too? He just nodded, his gaze steady. "I saw what happened at the station. Lawson's a fool." He pushed himself off the tree and took a step closer. "There's a boarding house run by a woman named Adley Quinn. It's clean, and the food's good. I can walk you there." She hesitated, suspicion warring with a desperate need for help. "Why would you do that?" He gave a slight shrug, his expression unreadable. "Because leaving a woman stranded isn't decent. And because folks who don't quite fit the mold," he said, his eyes meeting hers, "they're usually the ones who end up changing everything." There was something in the way he said it, a hidden meaning that sent a shiver down her spine. It wasn't just kindness. It was something else. A challenge, maybe, or a warning. As they walked back toward the flickering lights of the town, Lennon felt a strange shift in the air. This man, Creed Maddox, was a puzzle. He seemed to know more than he was letting on. And as they approached the boarding house, she saw curtains twitching in the windows of the houses they passed. Word in a town this small traveled faster than a wildfire. She was already the talk of Timber Falls. But they were all talking about the wrong thing. They thought her story was about rejection. They didn't realize it was just the beginning of a war. The boarding house was a haven of warmth and the smell of baking bread. Adley Quinn, the woman who ran it, was a whirlwind of silver hair and sharp, intelligent eyes. She took one look at Lennon, then at Creed standing behind her, and seemed to understand the entire situation in an instant. "You'll take the back room," Adley said, her voice raspy but kind. "It's got the best morning light. Creed, you tell your boys that if I find one more muddy boot on my porch, I'll be using it to serve them their breakfast." Creed just smiled, a rare, fleeting thing that softened the hard lines of his face. "Yes, ma'am." He tipped his hat to Lennon. "You'll be safe here, Miss Monroe." Then he was gone, disappearing into the twilight as silently as he'd appeared. Lennon slept better than she had in months, but she woke with a fierce determination. She wasn't leaving on Tuesday. She wasn't running away. She was going to make her stand right here, in the town that had tried to cast her out. She found Adley in the kitchen, humming as she flipped pancakes at a massive cast-iron stove. "So," Adley said, not even turning around, "what's the plan, dear? You can't stay here for free forever." "I sew," Lennon said, her voice stronger than it had been the day before. "I sew very well. Garments, alterations, mending, anything." Adley's eyes lit up. She slid a plate of pancakes onto the table. "The little room off the back porch used to be my husband's study. It's yours if you want it. This town's been without a decent seamstress since old Mrs. Gable passed." It wasn't charity, it was an opportunity. Within hours, Lennon had transformed the dusty little room. She had a small stash of fabric bolts, needles, and thread in her satchel, the tools of her trade, her only real inheritance. She set up shop, hanging a simple hand-painted sign on the boarding house porch. "L. Monroe, seamstress, fine stitching and repairs." The first customer arrived before noon. It was Mrs. Henley, the wife of the general store owner. She came with a dress that needed taking in, her eyes full of a pity that made Lennon's skin crawl. But Lennon took the dress, her fingers moving with practiced skill. She didn't just take it in, she reshaped it, giving it a style and elegance it never had before. When Mrs. Henley came to pick it up, her jaw dropped. "My word," she breathed, holding the dress up. "The stitches are so fine, they're nearly invisible. This is better than new." Word spread. The pastor's wife brought a torn altar cloth. A young mother brought a pile of children's clothes that needed mending. Lennon worked from dawn until dusk, her needle flying. The whispers that followed her through town began to change. They still called her the tall seamstress, but now there was a note of respect mixed in with the curiosity. Her work was too good, too meticulous to be ignored. She was proving her worth, one perfect stitch at a time. She was earning her place. Then on Thursday, a long shadow fell across her doorway. It was Creed Maddox. He stood there, holding his hat in his hands, filling the entire doorframe. The small room suddenly felt charged with electricity. "Miss Monroe," he said, his deep voice sending a vibration through the floorboards, "I have a proposition for you." She looked up from the logger's shirt she was mending, her needle poised in midair. "Oh?" "My crew," he said, stepping inside. "They tear through their gear faster than a bear through a berry patch. Shirts, trousers, canvas bags. None of them can sew a straight line to save their lives. I need someone to handle official repairs for the northern logging operation." "That's very generous, Mr. Maddox." "It's not generous. It's business," he corrected, his gaze intense. "You have a skill we need. I'll pay you a fair wage. We'll draw up a contract." A contract, a steady income. It was more than she could have hoped for. It was a foothold. But as she looked at him, at the unreadable expression in his storm gray eyes, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this. He wasn't just offering her a job. He was pulling her into his orbit, tying her future to his. Why? He seemed to read her thoughts. "Lawson's sawmill and my operation," he said, his voice dropping slightly. "We're not exactly friends. He undercuts my prices, tries to poach my best men. Having you work for me, it'll send a message." So that was it. She was a pawn in a business war between the two most powerful men in town, the man who rejected her and the man who saved her. It was more complicated than that, much more. "I accept," she said, meeting his gaze without flinching. If she was going to be a pawn, she'd be the most dangerous piece on the board. He nodded, a flicker of something. Approval? Respect? In his eyes. He paused at the door before he left. "There's a church social on Saturday night," he said, almost as an afterthought. "Good place to meet folks. Get more business." He hesitated for a fraction of a second. "You should go." It wasn't a suggestion, it was a command, and it felt like a test. As he walked away, Lennon realized the ground beneath her feet was shifting again. She had a business. She had an ally, however mysterious. She was no longer the victim. She was a player in a game she was only just beginning to understand. And she was starting to realize that Rhett Lawson's public rejection might have been the best thing that ever happened to her, because it had put her directly in the path of Creed Maddox, and she had a feeling the real storm in Timber Falls was just about to break. Saturday night arrived, crisp and smelling of pine smoke and fallen leaves. The sound of fiddles tuning up drifted from the church hall, a cheerful sound that did little to soothe the knot of anxiety in Lennon's stomach. She stood in front of the small mirror in her room, wearing a dress she'd made herself. It was a deep burgundy wool, the cut simple but elegant, designed to flatter her height instead of apologize for it. For the first time since she'd arrived, she felt a flicker of her old self. Not just tall, powerful. Adley Quinn walked with her to the social, a silent, steadying presence at her side. When they entered the hall, the lively chatter died down for a moment. Every head turned. But this time the stares were different. They weren't just looking at the freakishly tall woman who'd been rejected at the train station. They were looking at the seamstress who had fixed their clothes with near magical skill. She was becoming a part of the town's fabric, whether they liked it or not. She saw Rhett Lawson standing in a corner, surrounded by a group of his cronies. He was laughing at some joke, but his eyes were cold and hard. When he saw her, the laughter died on his lips. His face darkened into a scowl of pure resentment. He couldn't stand seeing her there, thriving, refusing to be broken. Good. Let him watch. The music started up, a lively reel, and the floor filled with dancing couples. Lennon stayed on the sidelines, content to observe. She wasn't here to dance. She was here to be seen, to show them all that she wasn't going anywhere. Then the music changed. The fiddles grew softer, the melody slower, more intimate, and the crowd near the doorway parted. Creed Maddox stood there. He wasn't wearing his rough work clothes. He was in a clean, pressed shirt and dark trousers that made him look even taller, even more imposing. He scanned the room, his storm gray eyes passing over everyone until they landed on her, and they stayed there. He crossed the hall with a slow, deliberate purpose that made the air crackle. He didn't stop until he was standing right in front of her. "Miss Monroe," he said, his voice a low rumble that was for her alone. "You look magnificent." A blush crept up her neck. "Thank you, Mr. Maddox. I didn't expect to see you here." "I said I might come," he replied, his eyes never leaving hers. Then he did something that silenced the entire room. He extended his hand. "Would you care to dance?" Her breath caught in her throat. Every single person was watching them. Dancing with him, the town's other titan of industry, would be a declaration. It would be choosing a side. It would be throwing a gauntlet right at Rhett Lawson's feet. "I'm not sure that's wise," she whispered. "Why not?" "People will talk." "Let them," he said simply, his hand still outstretched. "I'm not asking for their approval. I'm asking you to dance." She placed her hand in his. His grip was warm and strong, engulfing hers completely. He led her onto the dance floor, into the very center of the room. And for the first time in her entire life, when she looked at her dance partner, she was looking straight ahead, not down. They fit. They moved together as if they'd been doing it for years, his hand a firm, steady presence on the small of her back. The rest of the world faded away. There was only the music, in the solid feel of his arm, in the intensity of his gaze. "You're staring," he murmured, his breath warm against her ear. "I'm not used to this," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper, "being able to look a man in the eye." "Most men are fool," he said, his voice flat and certain. As the song swelled to its emotional peak, Lennon felt a sense of rightness, of belonging, that she had never known. This was what it felt like to be seen, to be met. Not as an oddity, but as an equal. But then, over his broad shoulder, she saw him. Rhett Lawson was watching them from the edge of the dance floor. His face was a mask of pure, undiluted fury. It wasn't just jealousy, it was something darker, more dangerous. The look in his eyes promised retribution. When their gazes locked across the room, he pushed himself off the wall and started walking toward them. His jaw was set, his fists clenched at his sides. The music was ending, but Lennon knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that the real confrontation was just about to begin, and it was going to be ugly. The final note of the fiddle hung in the air, and in the sudden silence, Rhett Lawson's voice was like the crack of a whip. "Well, well," he said, his voice loud enough to carry across the hall. "Quite the spectacle tonight." Couples nearby quickly stepped away, creating a wide circle around the three of them. Creed didn't turn around. He simply shifted his position, placing himself slightly in front of Lennon, a human shield. "Careful, Lawson," Creed said, his voice dangerously low. Red ignored him, his eyes fixed on Lennon with a venomous glare. "I'm just admiring the town's newest charity case. Making quite a name for herself, isn't she?" The insult was meant to cut deep, to remind everyone of her humiliating arrival. But it didn't work. Lennon straightened to her full, imposing height. "I am nobody's charity case, Mr. Lawson," she said, her voice ringing with cold clarity. "I earn my keep with my own two hands." "Skill?" Rhett let out a harsh, barking laugh. "You call playing with a needle and thread a skill? You're still just the woman nobody wanted." "That's enough," Creed growled, taking a step forward. But Lennon put a hand on his arm, stopping him. "No," she said, her eyes locked with Rhett's. "Let him speak. Let everyone in this town hear exactly what kind of man you are. A man who judges a person's worth by inches, and not by character." The hall was dead silent now. This was more than a lover's quarrel. This was a battle for the soul of the town. Rhett's face was turning a blotchy red. He was losing control. "At least I know what's proper. I know a woman's place." "A woman's place," Lennon shot back, her voice rising with a power she didn't know she possessed, "is wherever she can stand tall and be proud. And I would rather stand alone for the rest of my life than shrink myself to fit beside a man as small as you." The collective gasp from the crowd was audible. She hadn't just offended herself. She'd eviscerated him. Rhett opened his mouth to retort, but before he could, the town's judge, a stern-faced man named Porter, stepped between them. That is quite enough. This is a house of God, not a saloon brawl. Take your disagreements outside. The confrontation was over, but the whispers were just beginning. As Lennon walked out into the cool night air to catch her breath, she could feel the fallout settling around her. She had drawn a line in the sand. Creed followed her out, his face a thundercloud of controlled rage. I should have hit him, he muttered, clenching and unclenching his powerful hands. And prove him right? She asked, turning to face him. Prove that any man who associates with me is just looking for trouble? He stopped, the anger in his eyes softening as he looked at her. Do you really think I care what a man like Rhett Lawson thinks of me? You should, she said softly, the reality of her situation crashing down on her. This is your home. Reputations matter here. I've made you a target. He stepped closer, closing the space between them until she could feel the heat radiating from his body. You're right, he said, his voice dropping to that intimate rumble. Reputations do matter. And after tonight, everyone in that hall knows exactly who you are. A woman with more courage and more backbone than half the men in this county. They stood in a comfortable silence for a long moment, their breath misting in the cold air. The tension from the fight was still thrumming between them, but it was changing, morphing into something else, something powerful and unspoken. I'm heading up to the northern camp tomorrow, he said, finally breaking the spell. Winter's coming on fast. We need to get the last of the timber out before the snows trap us. A knot of anxiety tightened in her chest. How long will you be gone? A month, maybe more. Depends on the weather. He paused and the air grew heavy with the unasked question. Will you be here when I get back? He was asking if she was going to run, if Rhett's ugliness had finally succeeded in driving her away. Where else would I go? She asked, a small smile touching her lips. I have a business contract to fulfill. People are depending on me. She hesitated, then found the courage to say the rest. And maybe there's someone here worth waiting for. A slow smile spread across his face, reaching his eyes and making them shine in the moonlight. Then I'll try not to keep you waiting too long. He didn't touch her. He didn't have to. The promise was made, hanging in the space between them. As he walked away into the darkness, Lennon felt a sense of hope so fierce it almost hurt. She had faced down her tormentor. She had found an ally. She had found a purpose. Everything was finally falling into place. The next morning, as the sun was just beginning to touch the mountain peaks, a rider galloped into town. His horse was lathered in sweat, its sides heaving. The man's face was pale with panic. He burst into the boarding house kitchen, his words coming in ragged gasps. It's the northern camp. There's been an accident. Adley grabbed the man's arm. What happened? Speak plainly. A tree slide, the rider choked out. A whole section of the mountain just gave way. Caught 3 men. They're saying Creed Maddox was one of them. The coffee cup in Lennon's hand slipped from her fingers and shattered on the wooden floor. The hope she had felt just hours before turned to ice in her veins. Creed was hurt, or worse, and suddenly she understood with terrifying clarity. Rhett Lawson hadn't just been angry last night. He had been desperate, and a desperate man was capable of anything. This was no accident. This was an attack, and it was just the beginning. For the next 6 hours, Lennon was a ghost, pacing the floors of the boarding house, unable to eat, unable to sew. Her mind was a whirlwind of terrifying images. Creed trapped, crushed, alone. The rider had said they were bringing him down the mountain, but the journey was slow and treacherous. Every passing minute felt like an eternity. When the makeshift wagon finally creaked its way down the main street, her heart seized in her chest. A group of solemn-faced loggers carried a stretcher, and on it, a figure lay terrifyingly still. It was Creed. His face was ashen, a bloody gash stark against his pale skin. His right leg was bent at a sickening, unnatural angle. He was unconscious. Dr. Phillips, the town's gruff, no-nonsense physician, met them at his office. Lennon followed them inside, ignoring the protests of the loggers. She wasn't leaving his side. Miss Monroe, this is no place for you, the doctor said, his hands already working, cutting away Creed's blood-soaked trousers. "I'm not leaving," she stated, her voice shaking but firm. Something in her tone made him stop and look at her. He saw the raw fear and fierce determination in her eyes and simply nodded. "Fine, but stay out of the way." For 3 days and 3 nights, Lennon kept vigil. She became a silent fixture in the small infirmary, fetching clean bandages, holding lanterns steady, and listening to the doctor's grim pronouncements. A clean break in the femur, 3 cracked ribs, a severe concussion. He was lucky to be alive. The loggers who had been with him told the story. They'd been working a steep grade when the ground above them just let go. It was a freak occurrence, they said. Unpredictable. But as Lennon sat by Creed's bedside, listening to his shallow breathing, a dark suspicion took root in her mind. Freak occurrence? Or a carefully planned event? Rhett Lawson's face floated in her memory, his expression at the dance filled with murderous rage. On the 4th day, Creed's eyes fluttered open. They were hazy at first. Then they found her, and a flicker of recognition sharpened his gaze. "You're here," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "Where else would I be?" she replied, her voice thick with emotion, as she took his hand. "Thought I dreamed you," he murmured, his eyes closing again. Over the next few days, he drifted in and out of consciousness. But he was getting stronger. The color was returning to his face. Lennon established a routine. She'd work at her sewing business in the morning, earning the money she needed, and spend every afternoon and evening at his bedside. It was during one of those quiet afternoons that the door to the infirmary opened. A woman stood there. She was breathtakingly beautiful, with blonde hair coiled in an elegant chignon and a fashionable blue dress that must have come from a catalog in Portland. She moved with an air of effortless confidence, of someone who knew she belonged anywhere she went. Lennon's heart sank like a stone. "Hello, Creed," the woman said, her voice a soft, melodic chime. Creed, who had been dozing, opened his eyes. A look of complete and utter shock washed over his face. "Coulter?" he breathed. "Coulter. Coulter Vance." The woman Adley had mentioned in passing. The one who had broken Creed's heart 2 years ago, leaving him for a wealthy banker in the city. And now she was back. "I heard about the accident," Coulter said, gliding to his bedside. Her gaze flickered over to Lennon for a fraction of a second, a quick, dismissive appraisal, before returning to Creed. "I came as soon as I could." The air in the room became thick, charged with years of shared history that Lennon could never be a part of. "We need to talk, Creed," Coulter said, her voice dropping to an intimate whisper, a tone that made Lennon feel like a trespasser. I should go," Lennon said, standing up abruptly. The sewing in her lap fell to the floor. "No, Lennon, wait," Creed said quickly, his voice strained. But she couldn't stay. She couldn't watch this. "I have work to finish," she said, her voice tight. "I'll see you tomorrow." She fled from the room, her cheeks burning. It was happening all over again. The feeling of being too much, of not fitting in. Coulter Vance was everything she wasn't. Petite, polished, and undeniably a part of Creed's past. A past he'd clearly never gotten over. As she walked back to the boarding house, a cold, hard anger began to replace the hurt. She wasn't going to run. She wouldn't let this woman, this ghost from the past, drive her away. She would face this, just as she had faced everything else. But that night, unable to sleep, she walked past the doctor's office. The light was still on, and through the window, she saw something that made her blood run cold. It wasn't Coulter in the room with Creed. It was Rhett Lawson. He was standing over Creed's bed, his back to the window. He was talking in a low, menacing voice. Lennon couldn't hear the words, but she could see the fear on Creed's face. Even injured and helpless in his bed, Creed looked terrified. What was going on? Why would Rhett be there? It wasn't a social call, it was a threat. Then as Lennon watched, frozen in the shadows, Rhett reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out a small, heavy-looking leather pouch and dropped it onto the table beside Creed's bed. It landed with a soft, metallic clink. Coin. It was a bag of money. Rhett leaned in close, his expression predatory. He said something else, then turned and left, not even glancing at the window. Lennon's mind raced. the accident, Rhett's visit, the money. It didn't add up. Unless Creed wasn't Rhett's victim. What if he was his partner? The thought was sickening, a betrayal so profound it stole her breath. What if the rivalry was a sham? What if Creed's help had all been a lie? A calculated move in some larger game? He'd tied her to his business. He'd made her dependent on him. She had thought Rhett Lawson was the devil she knew. But maybe the real danger had been standing beside her all along, with his storm gray eyes and his devastating smile. Maybe Creed Maddox wasn't her savior. Maybe he was the man who was going to destroy them all. The whispers started the very next day. They followed Lennon like a plague as she walked to the general store. Every single day she's at his bedside, Mrs. Peterson murmured to her companion, just loud enough for Lennon to hear. It's not proper. Coulter Vance's return had fanned the flames of gossip into a raging inferno. The town was now divided. Team Coulter, the beautiful, appropriate choice from his past, versus Team Lennon, the tall, strange outsider. The pitying looks from the town's married women were back, sharper than before. They saw her as a desperate spinster, throwing herself at an injured man. The gossip hurt, but the seed of doubt that had been planted the night before hurt even more. She had to know the truth. She avoided the infirmary all morning, her mind a tangled mess of suspicion and fear. When she finally forced herself to go that afternoon, she found Creed propped up in bed, looking stronger and deeply troubled. Coulter was nowhere to be seen. "You didn't come this morning," he said, his voice laced with an accusation. "I had orders to fill," she said, the lie tasting like ash in her mouth. She couldn't look at him. She busied herself with the mending basket she'd brought. He was quiet for a long moment. "Coulter says the town is talking about us," he said carefully. Lennon's hands stilled. "Are they?" "She thinks, for the sake of your reputation, that perhaps you should space out your visits." The words were a physical blow. He was pushing her away, using Coulter's words, Coulter's concerns. Was this his way of getting rid of her? Had the money from Rhett been a payment to end things? "I see," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "It's not what I want, Lennon," he said quickly, his eyes pleading with her. "But maybe she's right. Maybe I've been selfish." "You never asked me to do anything," she interrupted, her control snapping. She stood up, her towering frame casting a long shadow over his bed. "I chose to come. I chose to stay, and I can choose to leave." "That's not what I meant." "Isn't it?" She began gathering her things with sharp, angry movements. "Perhaps Miss Vance is right. What business does a woman like me have caring for a man like you? You have your past sitting right here, Creed. Your beautiful, proper, socially acceptable past. I'm just the tall woman who doesn't know her place." "Lennon, don't do this." She turned at the door, her heart breaking, but her pride holding her together. "You should know," she said, her voice dripping with ice. "I saw Rhett Lawson leaving here late last night. It's funny. For two men who are such bitter rivals, you certainly keep strange company." The color drained from his face. For the first time, she saw genuine fear in his eyes. He opened his mouth to speak, to explain, but she was already gone, storming out into the street. Her mind was reeling. He was guilty. His reaction proved it. Whatever dark deal he'd made with Rhett, it was real. Blinded by anger and betrayal, she walked right into a commotion in the center of town. A crowd was gathered outside the town hall, and in the middle of it, standing on the steps, was Rhett Lawson. He was addressing the town, his voice slick and confident. "We cannot allow outside influences and backward-thinking sentiment to stand in the way of progress," he was shouting. "The Northern Railroad expansion will bring prosperity to Timber Falls. New jobs, new opportunities." "What's happening?" Lennon asked Martha Henley, who was standing at the edge of the crowd. "Emergency town meeting," Martha whispered, her face grim. "They've moved up the vote on the railroad expansion. It's happening tomorrow night." Lennon's blood ran cold. The northern expansion. Creed had told her about it. It was a disaster waiting to happen. It would mean clear-cutting the old-growth forest that protected the town's watershed. Creed had been fighting it for months, advocating for a safer southern route. Creed was supposed to present the opposition's case, Martha continued, wringing her hands. But now, with him laid up, who's speaking against it now? Lennon asked, a sense of dread washing over her. No one, Martha said, her voice trembling. Judge Porter's in Lawson's pocket. They're going to push the vote through tomorrow, no matter what. And then it all clicked into place. The accident. The timing was too perfect. It wasn't about Lennon at all. It was about this vote. Rhett hadn't tried to kill Creed because of a woman. He'd taken Creed off the board to silence the only powerful voice of opposition to his railroad scheme. But what about the money? Why would Rhett pay the man he'd just tried to murder? It made no sense. Unless the money wasn't a payment. What if it was blackmail? Lennon's mind raced back to the look on Creed's face when she'd mentioned Rhett's visit. It wasn't guilt. It was fear. He wasn't Rhett's partner. He was his prisoner. Rhett had something on Creed. Something terrible enough that even after being left for dead, Creed was still too afraid to speak out. That evening, a soft knock came at her door. She opened it to find Coulter Vance. Her beautiful face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed. "We need to talk," Coulter said, her voice stripped of its usual confidence. "I think we've said enough." "No, we haven't." Coulter pushed her way into the room. "I came back here for Creed. I made a mistake leaving him, and I was going to try and fix it. But I was wrong." Lennon waited, her arms crossed. "He doesn't love me anymore," Coulter said, the words a painful whisper. "He loves you. When he's half delirious with pain, he says your name. He's terrified that you'll leave, that what happened at the dance will drive you away." "Then why did he ask me to stay away?" "He didn't," Coulter insisted. "I suggested it. I was being selfish and petty, and I told him it was for your reputation. But it was for me. He was just trying to protect you from the gossip. And from Rhett." Coulter took a deep breath. "Rhett is dangerous. He's obsessed with this railroad deal. He told me he would ruin anyone who gets in his way. He said he has information that could destroy Creed's reputation, maybe even land him in jail." The blackmail. It was real. "Creed can't fight him," Coulter continued, tears welling in her eyes. "Not from that bed. And he's too proud to tell you the truth because he doesn't want to put you in danger. Rhett is going to destroy this town, and the only person who could have stopped him is neutralized." Coulter looked at Lennon, her blue eyes pleading. "But he isn't the only one." Lennon stared at her. "What are you talking about?" "You are," Coulter said, her voice gaining strength. "You have a voice, Lennon. They listen to you. You're not just the tall seamstress anymore. You're the woman who stood up to Rhett Lawson and won. You have his research, all his notes against the northern route. He trusts you." Coulter walked to the door, then turned back, a look of grim resolve on her face. "I'm leaving on the morning train. I can't win this fight, but you can. Don't let that monster win, Lennon. Stand up and fight for him. Fight for this town." The door closed, leaving Lennon alone in the silence. She was the only one left standing, a woman with no family, no connections, and no official standing in the town, against a ruthless, powerful man who had already proven he was willing to kill to get what he wanted. Going to that town hall meeting tomorrow night wouldn't just be professional suicide. It could get her killed. The next evening, the town hall was packed to the rafters. The air was thick with tension and the smell of wet wool and cheap tobacco. Lennon stood in the shadows at the back, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. On the stage at the front of the room, Rhett Lawson stood beside a large map, gesturing confidently with a pointer. He was a master showman, painting a beautiful picture of progress and prosperity, of a golden future brought to them by the railroad. He was selling them a lie, and they were buying it. Lennon clutched a leather folder full of Creed's research, geological surveys showing the instability of the northern mountainside, financial projections proving the southern route was more cost-effective in the long run, letters from other towns that had been devastated by the railroad company's predatory practices. It was all there, a mountain of evidence. But she was terrified. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the folder. She thought of Creed, lying in that infirmary bed, silenced and helpless. She thought of the cold fury in Rhett's eyes. This was insane. What could she, a newcomer, an outcast, possibly do? Rhett was wrapping up his speech, his voice booming with false sincerity. So I ask you, my friends, my neighbors, do you want to cling to the past, or do you want to build a better future for your children? Let's vote for progress. Let's vote for the Northern expansion. A wave of applause swept through the room. Judge Porter, his face impassive, stepped forward. Thank you, Mr. Lawson. A compelling argument. As there is no one prepared to speak for the opposition, I move that we proceed directly to the vote. This was it, her last chance. It was now or never. Taking a deep breath that did nothing to calm her racing heart, Lennon stepped out of the shadows. Excuse me, she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the noise like a surgeon's scalpel. The entire room went silent. Every single head swiveled to face her. The collective weight of their stares was a physical force. She could see the shock, the confusion, the outright hostility on some of their faces. And on the stage, she saw Rhett Lawson's confident smile curdle into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. I have something to say. She walked the long aisle to the front of the room, her tall frame commanding the space. Every step was an act of will. She could feel Rhett's hatred boring into her, but she didn't look at him. She looked at the people of Timber Falls. I know what many of you are thinking, she began, her voice gaining strength with every word. Who is she? What right does she have to speak? I am not from here. I have only been in this town for a few weeks. But in that time, I have learned something about this place that some of you seem to have forgotten. She reached the front and stood beside the stage, placing Creed's folder on the podium. You see this land as something to be conquered, to be exploited. But there is a man who sees it differently, a man who has spent 10 years learning its rhythms, protecting its balance. That man is Creed Maddox, and he cannot be here tonight to speak for himself, because last week, someone tried to murder him to keep him silent. A shocked murmur rippled through the crowd. Rhett's face went white. You call this progress? Lennon continued, her voice ringing through the hall. She tapped the map of the northern route. Creed's research calls it a catastrophe. This route will destroy the old-growth forest that holds these mountains together. It will destabilize the watershed that gives you clean water. It is not the cheapest or the safest route. It is simply the fastest way for Mr. Lawson and his partners at the railroad to get rich, and they don't care if it destroys this town in the process. This is an outrage, Rhett sputtered from the stage. She has no proof. These are baseless accusations. Oh, I have proof, Lennon said, her voice dangerously calm. She opened the folder and began. For 20 minutes, she laid out Creed's case with meticulous, undeniable logic. She presented the surveys, the financial data, the ecological impact reports. She spoke with a passion and clarity that held the entire room spellbound. She was no longer just Lennon Monroe, the seamstress. She was Creed's voice. She was the forest's voice. When she finished, the hall was stunned into silence. The townspeople were looking at each other, then at Rhett Lawson, their expressions shifting from support to suspicion. Judge Porter cleared his throat, looking rattled. Well, Miss Monroe, that was illuminating. Mr. Lawson, do you have a response to these, documents? Rhett was cornered. He was sputtering, trying to discredit the data, but the damage was done. The seeds of doubt had been sown, but he had one last card to play. The blackmail. This is all a distraction, he yelled, pointing a trembling finger at Lennon. This woman is merely a mouthpiece for a man who is not who you think he is. A man with a dark secret, a criminal past. The crowd gasped. All eyes were now on Lennon, waiting for her response. Her heart hammered. This was it, the secret Rhett held over Creed's head. But before she could say a word, a new voice cut through the tension. A raspy, familiar voice that dripped with authority. The only criminal in this room, Rhett Lawson, is you. The crowd parted. Adley Quinn, the silver-haired owner of the boarding house, was walking slowly toward the stage. Her usually kind face was set like granite. What are you talking about, you old woman? Rhett sneered. I'm talking about the fire at the land registry office in Portland 2 years ago, Adley said, her voice growing louder. The one that destroyed the original deed to the northern forests. The one that was ruled an accident. Rhett's face was now the color of ash. And I'm talking about the forged deed you used to sell the logging rights to the railroad, Adley continued, now standing directly in front of him. A deed that lists you as the sole owner. A deed you created after your father, my brother, died, cutting your own sister out of her inheritance. The room erupted in shocked shouts. Adley Quinn pointed a withered, trembling finger at Rhett. Creed Maddox found out. He found the evidence of the forgery. That's the secret you've been holding over his head. Not some dark past of his, but the proof of your crime. The accident on the mountain was your pathetic attempt to silence him for good. It was the final devastating blow. Rhett Lawson, exposed as a fraud, a thief, and a would-be murderer, simply crumbled. His face collapsed, and he stared at his aunt, the woman he had cheated and betrayed, with the terrified eyes of a guilty child. The vote, when it finally came, was unanimous. The northern expansion was dead. The southern route would proceed. As the crowd swarmed around Lennon and Adley, thanking them, clapping them on the back, Lennon felt a hand on her arm. She turned. It was Creed. He was standing there leaning heavily on a pair of rough-hewn crutches, his face pale and drawn, but his eyes were blazing with a mixture of pride, relief, and a love so profound it took her breath away. "How did you get here?" she whispered, rushing to his side. "The doctor said if I stayed in that bed one more minute, I'd go crazy," he rasped, "so he gave me these. I couldn't let you face him alone." He reached up with a shaky hand and gently touched her face. "You saved me, Lennon. You saved this town. I just spoke the truth." "You spoke for me when I couldn't speak for myself," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You stood up for all of us." Around them, the chaos of the town hall faded into a blur. There was only him. "I love you," he said, the words simple, raw, and undeniable. "I think I've loved you since the moment I saw you standing on that train platform, looking like you were ready to take on the world." He took a shaky breath. "I know the timing is terrible, and I'm a broken-down mess, but life is too short to waste. Marry me, Lennon Monroe." The world stopped. The whispers, the stares, the years of feeling like she was too much. It all melted away. "Marry me," he said again, his voice stronger now. "Be my wife, my partner, my equal. Help me build something that will last." She looked into his storm-gray eyes and saw her future. Not the one she'd been promised in a letter, but a real one, forged in fire and truth. A future where she would never have to shrink herself again. "Yes," she whispered, "yes." And in the middle of the crowded town hall, surrounded by the people who had once judged her, she leaned down and kissed him. The town erupted in cheers, a sound so full of acceptance and joy that it felt like coming home. The woman who had been rejected for her height had just become the hero who saved them all, and her real journey was just beginning. The wedding was 3 weeks later, a simple ceremony in the town's small church. The late November sun streamed through the windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Lennon stood at the altar in a dress of white silk she had sewn herself. It was elegant and understated, designed to celebrate her frame, not hide it. Most of the town was there. As she walked down the aisle, she met their eyes, and for the first time, she saw no judgment, no curiosity. She only saw respect and gratitude. Creed was waiting for her, leaning on a single polished cane. The smile on his face when he saw her was worth every moment of hardship she had endured. "I promise," he said, his voice rough with emotion as they exchanged their vows, "to always see you, to celebrate your strength, to honor your courage, and to love you exactly as tall as you are." When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, a cheer went up that shook the church's old wooden rafters. The reception was at the boarding house, a boisterous, joyful affair with long tables laden with food contributed by the entire town. As evening fell, Lennon and Creed stood on the porch, watching the last of the guests make their way home under a sky full of stars. The crisp mountain air smelled of pine and the promise of the first winter snow. "No regrets?" Creed asked, slipping his arm around her waist and pulling her close. "None," she said, leaning her head against his shoulder. "I spent my whole life feeling like I didn't fit anywhere, like I was too much. Now I can't imagine being anywhere else. You were never meant to fit in, Lennon, he said, turning to face her. His eyes were serious. You were meant to stand out. You were meant to show people like me, like this whole town, what real strength looks like. He leaned in and kissed her, a long, slow kiss that was full of promises for the future. As they stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, Lennon caught her reflection in the dark glass of the front window. She saw a woman standing tall, her head held high, her hand clasped firmly in her husband's. She was exactly the same height she had always been, but now she finally understood. She wasn't too tall. She had never been too much. She was exactly enough. Rhett Lawson, after the full extent of his crimes was revealed, he was arrested. He lost the sawmill, his reputation, and his freedom. He tried to take down a giant, but he forgot that the tallest trees have the deepest roots. Lennon and Creed Maddox built a life together, a true partnership. They ran the logging operation with a respect for the land that became a model for the entire state. And Lennon, the rejected mail-order bride, the seamstress, became the most respected woman in Timber Falls. A constant reminder that sometimes the very thing the world tries to shame you for is the source of your greatest power. Her story became a local legend, a tale about the tall woman who came to town and taught everyone that your true measure has nothing to do with your height and everything to do with the size of your courage. And that's a story worth telling. If you enjoyed this story and believe in the power of standing tall no matter what, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. And let me know in the comments, what's the biggest obstacle you've ever had to overcome? I read every single one. Thanks for listening.